close.
All I care about is stopping this maniac before he kills again. Do you understand? Come on, Dutch. You're blowing away a broad's date. The least you can do is drive her home.
His boss thinks he's trouble.
If you go to the media, I'll crucify you.
You had a bad day, didn't you?
How can you tell?
You always shake just a little.
His friends think he's crazy.
No 1 day suspended from the force, breaking and entering, robbery, and now possible murder.
In 1988, James Woods stepped out of his usual role as supporting actor in such major studio productions like Once Upon a Time in America and Against All Odds, and took top billing as well as co-produced the low-budget police procedural Cop, a very loose adaptation of James Ellroy's Blood on the Moon, the first of the Lloyd Hopkins trilogy. Cop is a strange movie in a lot of ways. It's not considered great, it's not considered bad. In fact, it's not considered at all. Not only has it never been talked about on YouTube, I've not seen a single review of Cop anywhere on social media. It's not discussed by film critics, audiences, or even the actors who are involved in the project. It's one of those movies that's never on TV, but maybe once or twice a year on Encore or Stars at 1 o'clock in the morning. And that's exactly what it is. A very low-key, quiet, but very engrossing murder mystery that caters to a niche audience. It's vulgar, misogynistic, cynical as hell, sexually graphic and explicit in detail, and features one of the most unlikable human beings in movie cop history. So why do I love it so much? Because all of those things I just mentioned are the key ingredients of a terrific modern-day film noir. But in the age of Rain Man, Roger Rabbit, and Beetlejuice, the late 80s were a time of multiplexes and box office blockbusters. Without the backing of a major studio and little interest from the public, Cop died almost on impact upon its very limited release. In addition to taking in a dismal $1.8 million at the box office, it was critically maligned. Pegged as nothing more than a cheap exploitation slasher with an immoral protagonist, scenes of gratuitous sex, and despicable acts of violence. It was an early 90s late-night Cinemax movie before there were early 90s late-night Cinemax movies. Back when lower-budget genre films were still squeaking their way into theaters. Like a lot of similar low-budget genre films of its time, Cop would quickly find its way to the fledgling USA Network, and not the good Mr. Robot Suits and Burn Notice USA Network that we know today. We're talking late 80s, bottom-of-the-barrel USA, where commercial flops like Wanted Dead or Alive, Wired, Hello Mary Lou, Prom Night 2, and Jack's Back were sent to get their second wind in late-night cable TV purgatory, to be played over and over again until they became a staple of Saturday night viewings. And like Jack's Back, another late 80s thriller from Atlantic releasing, both Siskel and Ebert gave a favorable review to Cop, praising James Woods' intense portrayal as the hot-wired, high-energy detective Lloyd Hopkins. Gene Siskel went on to describe Cop's climax as one of the most shocking and memorable endings he had ever seen in recent years, going so far as to give what he called a so-so film thumbs up based solely on its astonishing final shot. It's not polished by any standards. It's quick, abrupt, shocking, but uniquely satisfying in a way I'd never experienced before or since that first viewing. But that's not to say the rest of the movie's not as good, because it is. It's a basic serial killer plot with a typical rogue cop squaring off with the powers that be who don't approve of his tactics. Throw in the broken marriage, neglected kid, and a slew of torrid and meaningless affairs with random femme fatales, and you've got the makings of what might look on the surface as just another cliched police procedural. But what makes Cop work on a whole different level than most films of its kind is the cerebral approach James Woods brings to the character of Lloyd Hopkins. There are quiet scenes in this film with no dialogue where we watch Woods think, putting the pieces of this puzzle together, forming his case. Although the case in question isn't very interesting or original, it's the getting there that's the real pleasure to behold. Watching Hopkins eating cold pizza, sucking down yesterday's coffee, and thumbing through crime scene photos of cold murder cases, while attempting to make a connection to his own, might seem boring or expository if left in the wrong actor's hands. Woods makes it all work because he's capable of bringing his internal voice to the screen without spitting unnecessary exposition in our faces. He does it with his eyes, his body language, until we're right there in that room with him, seeing what he sees, feeling what he's feeling. It not only becomes his journey, but our own. And there's real subtext in this movie buried beneath the sleaze and sweaty sex. Hopkins parades through this movie with little to no respect for any of the female characters he encounters, and treats them mostly as sexual objects to be disposed of at his leisure. At the same time, he has an 8-year-old little girl at home he adores and wants nothing else but to protect her from the slimy world he not only lives in but has come to embrace. There's real irony in this character. Although he's an unapologetic womanizer and misogynist, his obsession is tracking killers of women, as if to tell the audience, I know who I am and I hate what I've become. There's some dialogue early on in this film where Woods discusses the concept of innocence kills with his estranged wife. That women are taught when they're still little girls to have unattainably high expectations and feel entitled to happiness like it's a birthright. This argument with his wife has to do with how he's choosing to raise their 8-year-old daughter, Penny. Instead of tucking her in and telling her about the 3 bears, Hopkins gives her a point-for-point account of how he just busted a guy in full drag B&E on a robbery stakeout.
Tell me how you got this scumbag, Daddy.
A ludicrous idea to most sane people who don't live and breathe sex, death, and violence 24/7. His argument is that he's preparing her for the real ugliness of the world, to not become a victim because you had unrealistic expectations of how the world should be as opposed to how it really is. He's a completely cynical man who has completely lost all hope in the basic idea of good versus evil, to the point that he's become almost as bad as the filth he's tracking down. All the while, he's ironically obsessing over catching a killer of women, as if to tell the audience that he secretly resents what he's become. A cold-blooded predator, not unlike the men he hunts and puts behind bars. In Cop, the killer's main target of obsession is Kathleen McCarthy, played by Leslie Ann Warren, in what might be the most hammed-up, over-the-top performance since Shelley Duvall in The Shining. Kathleen is a stunningly naive woman who still believes in white knights and fairy tales, and refuses to believe the same man who's been sending her handwritten poems and flowers for the last 15 years could be capable of such terrible violence. It's her own beliefs in the goodness of people that keeps her from accepting the painful truth about her secret admirer. And ironically, the only one who can save her from herself is Hopkins, a predator of women in his own right. A man who has also preyed on Kathleen's naive and childlike innocence to fulfill his own sexual desires. As the title implies, he's a cop first, human being second. You could write essays about this little low-budget movie. It's that interesting of a movie and a character, in a film that's been unfairly maligned and labeled a forgetful and generic cop thriller. If you've already seen this film, or at least the final 20 minutes, you know there is nothing forgetful about Cop. If you haven't seen Cop, all I can say is, as far as disposable 80s crime films with generic titles, it may truly be the best of its kind. I'd rank it right up there with the likes of Sharky's Machine, Tightrope, and Body Heat as one of the best film noirs of the last 30 years. I'd also say it's the best performance of James Woods' career, and in my opinion, the best ending to a movie I've ever seen. Despite its reputation as a critical failure, Cop currently sits at 81% on the tomato meter, proving that this little indie gem has stood the test of time and has finally gotten the recognition that it deserves. Check it out and let me know what you think.